I, my wife and I are trying to decide whether the pandemic caused Zoom to do well, or Zoom was around and the rest of us decided that it was one way to actually communicate with other people without having to stay at home and keep quiet. Really do happy to have this opportunity.
Okay, folks, I hope everybody can hear me and see me. Welcome to McLean County Barns of the late 19th century. We're glad you could join us on this snowy and cold evening. It means a lot to barn keepers that you're here, certainly. And who exactly are barn keepers? Well, we're a McLean County, Illinois-based not-for-profit organization devoted to the documentation, preservation, restoration, and celebration of area barns. First, a quick note, I am recording this session, so please note that. You also might want to mute yourself so folks can't accidentally hear yourself during the presentation. Let's start. So I'm currently the president of the Barn Keepers Board, and the joke goes, with great power comes great responsibility. But during the day, I'm the librarian of the not-for-profit McLean County Museum of History. If you have questions or comments, please make use of the chat board, but address it to all. I won't see questions if they're addressed directly to me, and I'll try to answer a few of them if there are any at the end. You can also email me at your leisure. So I hope everybody can see the images just fine. Just before we get to the program, just a few things barn keepers do. Board member Ron Ropp has bravely led our Centennial Barn Program, in which owners of 100 years or older barns apply for and receive a handsome reflective sign to commemorate the barn's history. Centennial Barn applications are available on our website, www.barnkeepers.org. And we have 2 board members, at least 2, that have Centennial Barns that have been awarded such. Ron lives in the converted 1910 Ropp family barn in Northwest Normal Township, while Dave and his wife Diane live in Allen Township near Stanford. Their turn of the last century barn was built to shelter and feed horses. The English style barn rests on large wooden beams atop hand-cut limestone, with the beams attached with wooden pegs. In 2011, the Stevens contracted with barn restorer and contractor John Ropp, who's Ron Ropp's son. It is a small town. The barn was then raised 26 inches and new beams installed on 2 sides. New doors were also added and some siding replaced using salvaged wood from a raised corn crib. Barn upkeep and restoration tends to run on the expensive side, to say the least. The annual September Barn Tour is our showcase event. Unfortunately, given the COVID-19 pandemic, we canceled the 2020 tour, which was supposed to be, we were hoping, highlighting barns in the Anchor and Cropsey Townships area. But now, with the slow vaccination rollout and talk of our country still chasing herd immunity into the late summer, well, we're beginning to think it's asking a lot for farmers and their families to welcome several hundred strangers onto their property. So we're not quite sure what we're going to do, to be honest with you. We're already banding about alternatives, such as a drive-by tour of selected farmsteads and barns and historic sites. So there will be a tour of some sort. We're just not going to be sure what exactly it's going to look like. So stay tuned. In 1955, there were something like 4,500 barns in McLean County. By 2002, a survey conducted by a group that would become the Barn Keepers, it's really the origin of the Barn Keepers, this counting project, totaled up 1,200 remaining barns. That was in 2002. So a 73% decrease from 1955 to 2002. And in the nearly 2 decades since the 2002 survey, the losses have continued apace. So how do we know there are around 4,500 barns in McLean County back in 1955? Well, we know that, or have a good idea, because of this wonderful volume, This is McLean County, published by the Laurie Company of Chicago in 1955. And other counties with rich agricultural heritages also had similar volumes. So in the Laurie editions, you get an aerial photograph of almost every single farmstead in a county. And so what the predecessor to Barn Keepers, or the origin of the group, did was they had volunteers going through the Laurie reference book of 1955 and counting every single barn they found to get that number. And here's an example. Charles Lubdell's 80 acres in Martin Township and Sarah Summers' 4,400 acres by way of a renter or tenant, George Stoller. We get to see their two farms circa 1955 in pretty good detail. Yes, George Stoller was the tenant farmer for Sarah Summers. The rate of farm tenancy in McLean County has always been high, going back to the pre-Civil War settlement period up to the present day, so that's not unusual. Now, the resolution on these Laurie editions isn't fantastic, but it's usually sufficient for identification of buildings, barring, of course, interfering foliage. That was always a problem. So a shout out to Don Meyer, a local ag educator and guest curator of the McLean County Museum of History's Farming in the Great Corn Belt exhibit, for helping me decipher a few things we see here. And I hope you can see my pointer. Okay, everybody can see my pointer, good. The upper left, we see a partially obscured house, a New England square barn with a broken gable extension. By broken gable, I mean it doesn't keep the exact angle of the original roof of the original barn. We see a corn crib, a collection of small outbuildings, and what's likely a chicken house based on the appearance of the roof vents. Now, if we go down lower to the lower right, among the many things we see are a concrete block or glazed tile oval corn crib, a large hog house with outdoor pens, a corn crib with a portable elevator running to the cupola, and a single or single-sided corn crib. And there's also a machine shed and a garage. So you're getting a lot of really interesting detail. There's that, I'm pointing the arrow there to the hog house with outdoor pens. And there we see the corn crib with the portable elevator to transfer ear corn up into the cupola and then to spread it to the two side bins. The number and diversity of barns and outbuildings certainly is stunning when compared to the farms of today. And that'll be, I think, one of the themes of our talk. Okay. So in the talk, we're going to look primarily at two sources because they both have wonderful views of McLean County farmsteads in the latter half of the 19th century. The first volume or work we're going to be looking at is the Atlas of McLean County, published in 1874. And that's going to be referred to henceforth as primarily the 1874 Atlas. And we're also going to look at the Portrait and Biographical album of McLean County, which was published in 1887. And that will be referred to in the talk as the 1887 album. So we're going to look at images, illustrations in both of those two volumes. The 1874 McLean County Atlas is a beauty for sure. It's 19 by 18 inches in size. It's hefty for sure. Such commercial works are regarded as the high point in the history of popular American cartography. So says William Walters, a retired Illinois State University historical geographer, and I'm not going to argue with Bill on that one there. So in McLean County, the first published atlas was 1874. There was then a second one in 1895 and then a third in 1914. How are these put together? How are they commercially profitable and who bought them? Well, they were subscription based. You had two waves of salesmen descend on a county. The first to obtain subscriptions and the second to sell what were known as add-ons, illustrations of farms, illustrations of blooded stock, biographical sketches of prominent farmers or business people, things of that nature. A premium subscription would pay for a lithographic portrait of oneself, or as I mentioned, of your farm, of your business, or even if you wanted to showcase your blooded hogs or your beef cattle. Biographies at this time cost 2.5 cents a word, and you had to spend at least $10. You'd receive one book gratis if you paid for a full biography. By the way, you might think, $10, what's that? In 1874, that would be the equivalent today, adjusted for inflation, of about $230. So that's what a book would have cost. We must treat biographies as they appear in these atlases and then the biographical albums I'll talk about in a moment, circumspectly, right? Because they were written, they were dictated, and they were certainly approved by the subject. So you're getting a specific kind of history. You're getting a biographical sketch of a person in the way they wanted it to be read and understood. So you have to understand that. As such, we must keep in mind not only those farmers and farms that are shown in these volumes, but we must keep in mind those that are not. In other words, as wisdom tells us, what's not seen is sometimes as important, or perhaps even more so, than what is seen. Okay, let's take a moment now, after all my yakking, to enjoy this lovely steel engraving from the 1874 McLean County Atlas. A good representation of the just jaw-droppingly detailed illustrations you're going to see in these volumes. Here is an accurate, if somewhat idealized, view of the David Stevens farm in Danvers Township. And as I say, one thing you don't get is the mud, right? One thing that defines central Illinois is mud, and you don't see that here. These are very clean farmsteads, and trust me, they rarely, if ever, were. So it's an idealized view, certainly, but accurate when it comes to building types, architectural details, even shrubbery and trees, locations of fields, pens, things of that nature. We can count on this. So what do you see here, right? What draws your attention, or what draws your curiosity? So we're going to enlarge this image. Yes, that's beautiful, right? If you love barns. This would have been the standard barn of its day in 1874. What's known as a English style or 3-bay style barn, with the main doors on the lateral or non-gable side of the square barn. These barns obviously were multi-purpose. Look at the fenced-in area, the lot right outside the barn itself. You have horses, dairy cows or beef cattle, or both perhaps, hogs, and either a few goats or sheep in the mix there as well. Yes, one of the goals of these illustrations was to emphasize order, right? Order overlaying the plants and the animals that the farmer is managing as a right husbandry, from the corn crop to the hogs, and then the order overlaying the human economy as well, the family household, right? So you get a visual representation, a message here of progress, of commercial success, of fecundity, right? The richness of Mother Nature. but also implanting on that richness, the wildness of Mother Nature, order, domesticity, right? Regulations and profitability. So again, we are seeing an accurate, to some extent, view of a McLean County farmstead, but it's a very specific one in a lot of ways. And notice, yes, that's the children there playing croquet. The role of plant nurseries, which I alluded to in remaking the Corn Belt, is really striking. So I know environmental historians and others have examined these illustrations, not only in McLean County, but other counties as well throughout the Midwest, to identify types of shade and fruit trees, ornamental shrubs, and hedges. And notice there in the lower right, and one of the enlargements, we see a windmill, which would have been relatively uncommon in 1874. And I'll talk about windmills more in a second. And again, we are going to additional enlargements of the David Stevenson Farm in Danvers Township. Here we see fencing and hedges, both fencing constructed of wood, probably cheap pine lumber coming from the North Woods. We're in the railroad era, I should say, at this time. But we also have living hedge there, and I'll be talking about that down the road in this talk as well. So more on hedging later. This is the Peter Folsom map of McLean County of 1856. It's important to us because it shows, it's an accurate map of the wooded groves and timbered tracts of McLean County as they would have been prior to the arrival of Euro-Americans in the 1820s. So we're seeing both an early settlement map of McLean County, but also a relatively natural, showing the natural landscape of McLean County. So we are on the Grand Prairie, right? This is the Prairie State, but so nearly 90% of McLean County prior to the arrival of the first permanent settlers, which were in the early 1820s, about 90% of McLean County, 670,000 acres, was in tall grass prairie, but the remaining 10% or so was in timber, right? So we have wooded tracts or groves throughout the county. South of, if you follow the pointer here, south of Bloomington Normal would be Blooming Grove, correct? The most well-known grove today would be Funk's Grove, south on 55. This is Stouts Grove. We have Twin and Dry Grove, Cheney's Grove. We have Randolph's Grove. And then the largest timbered tract in McLean County is following the watercourse of the Mackinac River. That's known as the Mackinac timber right there. And then this other large blob is the Old Town timber, named for a Kickapoo settlement and following roughly the ridge line of the glacial moraine that cuts through the heart of McLean County. Arthur Watterson, who was a longtime Illinois State University geography professor and the namesake of Watterson Towers, one of the largest college dormitories in the United States. This image comes from Arthur Watterson's University of Chicago PhD dissertation on land use in McLean County. And what I like about it, so the darkened sections indicate that those sections are no longer in the public domain. They have been snapped up by either a speculator or a settler, right? So that means that land is no longer in public domain. It is owned privately. So this is in many ways a rough map of what people would have thought in 1830 would be the most valuable tracts in McLean County. And what do we see? They're all in the wooded zones of the county, right? Blooming Grove, Twin and Dry Grove, a little bit of Stouts Grove, the early settlement of the timber tract along the Mackinac River up there, Randolph's Grove down there where present-day Hayworth is located, and of course Funk's Grove down there. That's all we see in 1830. As an aside, and kind of unrelated, David Watterson, who's the late Dr. Watterson's son. David lives in Normal, hopefully not under the shadow of the dormitory that carries his father's name. That would be a burden for sure. But the son, David Watterson, donated to the McLean County Museum of History a typed copy of his father's University of Chicago master's dissertation titled The Distribution of Hybrid Corn in the Corn Belt. We get a lot of WOW donations at the McLean County Museum of History. We are a nationally accredited museum, and this was certainly one of them. So we're going to flash forward here to 1845, and I'm going to compare the Folsom map showing the original wooded tracts with the land entries map created by Arthur Weldon Watterson for his PhD dissertation. What McLean County, those lands that were no longer in public domain in 1845. And it is really stunning when you see how privately held land in McLean County is almost mirroring almost exactly the wooded tract. So I'm showing this because we can see the settlement pattern as farmers began to slowly move out onto the prairie, given changes in the technology to cut through this thickly matted prairie sod, and also the arrival of railroads would be a game changer as well. Railroads arrived in McLean County in 1850. McLean County itself is established in 1830. Bloomington gets going in the summer of 1831 as the county seat. But things move very slowly until the arrival of railroads in 1853. First the Illinois Central, and then what becomes the Chicago and Alton. Utterly revolutionary, unprecedented. Railroads will transform agriculture, industry, immigration patterns, politics, communication, and media, and on and on. And in many ways, almost overnight, especially in areas like McLean County that, unlike Peoria, unlike Quincy, unlike Chicago, unlike Alton, right? There's no navigable waterway in McLean County. So before the arrival of railroads, economic activity could only move at a certain pace, right? Rail lines efficiently then would siphon livestock and grain to milling and meatpacking centers, primarily Chicago. What once took 2 or more weeks to march cattle from Funk's Grove up to Chicago before the railroads to the emerging stockyards and meatpacking center on the south end of Chicago, with the arrival of railroads now would only take a day or so, right? So between 1860 and 1880, the built environment of the Corn Belt countryside underwent just an utter transformation as a great number of new barns were joined by hundreds of new farmhouses and many hundreds of substantial outbuildings. And this all occurred or was made possible by the arrival of railroads. By 1880, the unimproved, so-called unimproved prairie had almost vanished. In the decade preceding, interestingly, the county had added 1,500 farms without reducing the average farm size, meaning the county was adding new farm acreage, right? And creating new farms. In 1880, interestingly, there were 5,466 farms in McLean County. The average farm size was 134 acres. 1880, 5,466 farms, average farm size 134 acres. Today, well, 2017, 1,416 farms, average farm size 438 acres. So today we have nearly 4 times fewer farms than we did in 1880. And with fewer farms, of course, comes just an utter collapse in the rural population. What I want to point out in this map also is just the density of the rail web by 1874 in McLean County. Okay. Striking transformation of the Corn Belt countryside caused by railroads. Again, if you follow my cursor, this would be the first railroad to come into the county in 1853. That's the Illinois Central Railroad. And then that occurred in the spring of 1853. And then in the fall of 1853, you have the Chicago and Alton Railroad. Today, Union Pacific and Amtrak. That becomes the most important railroad, obviously, in McLean County because you're connecting Chicago to St. Louis and points in between. As dense as the rail web was in 1874, it didn't touch right every corner of McLean County. If you look at the map, you notice this stretch of the county right here was the last to be visited by rail traffic. The northeast section of McLean County was wetter than much of the rest of county, with large pockets of seasonal standing water. And this part of the county had to wait for the development of clay drain tile. So once you had that advancement, technological advancement, you could begin to open up that land. Another problem was once you crossed the Mackinac timber, there was very little very little timber available in this corner of the county, which made it even that more difficult to settle. And then, of course, that corner of McLean County would have its own railroad known as the Bloomer Line, which opened in the late 1870s. The Illinois Central Railroad's Bloomington District ran from Normal to Otto and Kankakee County. This Bloomer Line connected the Illinois Central's two main north-south routes, scooping up grain along the way. So by this time, 1895, you're seeing the map here, McLean County could boast one of the highest railroad densities of any place in the United States, if not the world. And that was why? Because of agriculture, because of our soil, right? Few farms in McLean County by the late 1800s were more than 4 miles from the nearest railroad tracks. So if we look at the Bloomer Line, right here, locally, this right-of-way survives as a branch of Constitution Trail, right? Running east over Linden Avenue, past the shops at College Hills Mall, and down GE Road. Barnes, the namesake of Towanda Barnes Road, Cooksville, Colfax, Anchor, Cropsey, all owe their existence to the Bloomer Line. Today, this line, east from Colfax, is owned by the Gibson City-based Alliance Grain Company and is known as the Bloomer Shippers Connecting Railroad. So the most common types of barns we're going to see in these illustrations, the English style or 3-bay barn, we've already seen a view of it, features main doors or double doors on the lateral or non-gable side of the barn, usually dominated by a wide threshing driveway, a crosswise breezeway, if you will, also known as a pull-through, because it enabled wagons to be driven into and through the barn to unload feed or hay into the mow above. So you had the English style barn. An update of the English style barn was the New England barn, and it can be identified by the main doors on the ends of the barn or under the gables. Both barn types we see here, the English and the New England, are also known as standard square barns. And it kind of goes without saying, and I've alluded to it already, but these barns were mixed use, multi-purpose buildings designed to shelter and feed livestock, store hay and grain and other feed stuff, a place to park implements and to repair tack and equipment, kind of a one-stop building. Some barn experts, such as H. Wayne Price, divide barn architecture into 2 main eras, right? The first era was vernacular barns, constructed of hand-hewn timber with design styles and floor plans based on local tradition and lifeways. The early pioneer period, vernacular architecture, rough-hewn timbers. The second era, post-Civil War, generally speaking, but it got underway before the war, featured agricultural publications such as the Chicago-based Prairie Farmer offering blueprints or prototypical barn plans. Then pattern books began appearing, with manufacturers and dealers offering barn packages complete with all the necessary cut-to-fit lumber and hardware and nails and roofing. Needless to say, plank framing and dimension lumber marked the end of barns erected with heavy timbers. And all of this was made available via the railroad, right? These barn packages are being shipped by railroads. And if you're just basing your new barn on a prototypical plan you got from the Prairie Farmer, you're having that lumber shipped by railroad more often than not. The time period we're looking at this evening, the latter decades of the 19th century, really encompass both the vernacular and the more commercial eras of barn types. Let's look at some English style barns that are still around in McLean County. We have the OMH Family Farms barn, which was on our 2018 Barnkeepers Barn Tour of Bellflower Township in the southeast corner of McLean County. Although it may not look like much to the city slicker, and I'm talking about the barn in the upper left corner, the white barn, when I talked to farm operator John Leonard in preparation for the 2018 barn tour, he told me that the barn dates to circa 1860, and the original owner was O.M. Hatch, who lived in Springfield and was a political ally of Abraham Lincoln. And if you know your Illinois politics, the name will ring a bell because he served as Illinois Secretary of State under no less than 3 governors. And interestingly, the present owners represent the 5th generation of the Hatch family associated with this Bellflower Township farm. Another English style barn, also in Bellflower Township, and also highlighted on our 2018 barn tour, was this barn by Don and Connie, now owned by Don and Connie Warsaw. It was built in 1890 and originally painted red and used for horses. It was modernized in the 1950s. The single entrance was replaced with 2 entrances. An extension was added to shelter cattle and hogs. A concrete foundation was added. The cupola came down in the 1970s. A metal roof was put on around that time. And from the 1960s to the 1980s, the barn was used to farrow hogs, and it is now used, like a lot of old barns, to store seed or equipment and such things. And certainly, if you get a sense from just the story of this barn, every barn, just like every picture, has a story to tell, that's for sure. The early 20th century brought a revolution in new materials for barn construction. The most important, obviously, was concrete. And that's one thing we won't see when we look at images from 1874 and 1887. Concrete, or rather Portland cement. Farmers built retaining walls and barnyard floors and chicken coops and tool sheds, milking parlors, windmill foundations, fence posts, cisterns, corn cribs, about everything you can imagine out of concrete. Let's look at a few New England style barns that are still around today. The lower right, or red barn, the date of Bob and Diana Zimmerman's red barn is unknown. Again, this was on our 2018 Bellflower Township barn tour. In the early 1950s, the concrete block foundation was added, so they had to raise the wood board and batten siding to drier heights, and the steel roof was added within the last decade or so. One type of barn you will not see in the 1874 Atlas or the 1887 album are the gambrel style barns. Today, the second most common barn type in the Corn Belt features a gambrel style roof, and that's a symmetrical 2-sided roof with 2 slopes on each side. The upper slope is positioned at a shallow angle while the lower slope is steeper. This design provides the advantages of a sloped roof while maximizing headroom for an expanded haymow. And it's a key to managing dairy herds. Though in McLean County, gambrel barns were also often associated with beef cattle operations as well. These types of barns, and you see them all over the place today, were built in great numbers during the first half of the 20th century. This barn was on our 2017 Barnkeepers Barn Tour of Hudson Township. The barn dates to the early 20th century. Oscar Hinshaw used the barn for beef cattle, and today his great-granddaughter Stacy and her husband Luke used the barn for a purebred Angus cattle operation. The barn's interior was extensively remodeled in 2001, work which included the installation of a drop-down staircase to the haymow. Pretty neat, huh? Another type of barn you won't see in 1874 or 1887 would be the Gothic arch barn. And here we see the Stevenson family place that was on our Hudson Township barn tour back in 2017. This barn was likely first used as a small dairy operation and later converted for beef cattle. There was water damage in the haymow, So that's when the steel roof was then put on. And the joke goes, if you want to have a farm outbuilding or barn come down, just punch a hole in the roof and let the water and the elements come in and just stand back and watch, right? So steel or metal roofs, although they aren't the best choice if you're interested in strict historic preservation, barn keepers, people interested in preservation, actually encourage steel roofs because it prolongs the life of barns so extensively, as we can see here. In 1969, Lawrence Krugman and Darrell Whitman examined the built environment of rural McLean County by way of existing barns and corn cribs and grain bins and windmills and other outbuildings. And they identified three major barn forms or types in McLean County. The most popular was the gable or standard square barn, with or without an addition or projection. The second most popular was the gambrel barn. And the third was the Gothic style barn with its steep pitched roof that we see here. At the time of the study, gable or standard square barns were the predominant barn style, comprising about 40% of all barns in McLean County. And then, of course, we will not see in the 1874 Atlas or 1887 Portrait and Biographical album of McLean County any double-sided corn cribs, right? The standard corn belt corn crib of the 20th century, often mistaken by city slickers as barns. But of course, these were used exclusively for the storage and drying of grain, primarily ear corn. So before the development of combines that mechanically pick, husk, and shell corn right in the field, you needed corn cribs to dry your ear corn, right? And those distinctive slatted sides promoted natural air circulation and thus hastened the drying process. So let us now return to the 1874 Atlas. This is a typical page with two steel engraving illustrations. Jesse Trimmer built this Italianate style residence on the edge of Lexington in 1866. That's the image you see above. 1 year after the Civil War. The Italianate elements, of course, include the low-pitched roof, the narrow windows, and the bracketed cornice. John and Eliza Trimmer and their 8 children, including 8-year-old Jesse, settled in Money Creek Township in 1826, 4 years before the establishment of McLean County. And then young Jesse would go on to accumulate about 2,000 acres, mostly in Lexington and adjacent Money Creek Township. And then he would build this beautiful Italianate residence as a testament to his worldly success. There we see an enlargement there. Noah and Sarah Franklin purchased the Trimmer place in 1877. Sarah was a niece of Jesse, and it has remained in the Franklin family ever since. The current occupants, John and Kathy Franklin, moved in 2000, and this was on our last barn tour in 2019. This house is in Lexington proper. And there we're going back to the 1874 Atlas, and there we see an outbuilding and the barn or carriage house for the Trimmer Town residents. And it survives today, and it looks almost as it did in 1874. Is that not cool? And there are 2 additional views. So this would be an English style square barn, common for the era and kept up by the Franklins. And it was, as I said, a stop on our last tour, which was 2019. Marquis de Lafayette Funk managed his father Isaac's inheritance. And Lafayette Funk's son, Eugene Duncan Funk, played a prominent role in the establishment of Funk Brothers Seed Company of hybrid corn fame and, heck, even international fame, right? So if you know your McLean County history, Isaac Funk is one of the most important early settlers to McLean County, the patriarch of the Funk clan, which is still prominent and influential in the county today. His son, Lafayette Funk, then built this residence in 1863, 1864 from felled timber at Funk's Grove. And there's a nice enlargement of the image. And again, you always, in the 1874 Atlas and the 1887 Atlas and other works of this nature, you're always getting scenes of domesticity. Lafayette Funk married Elizabeth Paulin in 1864 in the New Homes parlor, and Elizabeth was still around in the late 1920s, early 1930s, long after Lafayette had passed away. And here's a wonderful photograph taken by Clara Bryan, who was the first McLean County Home Bureau advisor and one of the more remarkable individuals in the 20th century in McLean County history. And as we can see here, she was also an accomplished amateur photographer. And of course, the Funk Prairie Home, Lafayette's former residence, is now a historic site. And if you haven't visited the Funk Prairie Home and been treated to manager Bill Case's tour, you're really missing out. So once we get a handle on COVID-19, any day now, right? You'll be able to tour once again the Funk Prairie Home historic site. It's definitely worth it, and only about 15 or so minutes south, not even that, south of Bloomington. But what's most important to us is Lafayette Funk's 1861 New England style barn, which we see here in the 1874 Atlas, built in 1861 or thereabouts. One of the oldest in the county certainly. Rick Janusz, who helps oversee the site, has said it's probably the largest wood peg barn left in the county, and I'm not going to argue with Rick. It was renovated in the 1990s and restored to something like its original appearance, as we can see there. 42 by 52 feet, not very large, certainly by today's machine shed standards. It has a saddle and tack room, spaces for grain storage, and a hayloft. One side of the main floor, right, has a brick floor, and that was for the carriage horses. And the other side has a wood floor, and that was for the work or the draft horses. So now let's turn our attention. We've looked at a few images from the 1874 Atlas. Now let's turn our attention to the Portrait and Biographical album of McLean County, published in 1887. It comes in 1 or 2 volumes. It's a massive work. Collections of biographical genealogical sketches of prominent residents, such as this one, were cousins, if you will, to the large format coffee table plat books and atlases, one that we just looked at, the 1874. They were similar, but also a little bit different. Much like county atlases and plat books, Chapman Brothers portrait and biographical albums were subscription-based, meaning biographical sketches, as well as lithographic portraits of one's own person, farm, blooded stock, or business, would cost you money. And the larger illustration you wanted, from 1/3 a page to a full page, the more you had to pay Chapman Brothers. In these sets, county biographies and portraits were dropped into pre-existing templates of portraits and biographies of U.S. presidents and Illinois governors. For instance, the 1887 McLean County album, pages 19 to 180 feature presidents and Illinois governors, while the rest of the 2 volumes, page 181 all the way to page 1210, consist of local biographies, portraits, and illustrations. And this would be a representative page of the 1887 album. Here we see 3 of the nearly 90 farmsteads featured in it. Chapman Brothers published such portrait and biographical albums in Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, and Nebraska. And in Illinois, there were 19 volumes representing the larger, wealthier counties, agricultural counties, such as McLean. McLean County's volume, as we know, as we see here, dates to 1887, while Livingston's Counties was published in 1888, Woodford's in 1889, DeWitt and Piatt County had a combined album published in 1891, and Champaign County followed in 1892. Reported the Pantograph in June 28, 1886, quote, Chapman Brothers, the extensive publishing house of Chicago, have, we learned, decided to come into McLean County for the purpose of getting out an edition of their elegant portrait and biographical albums for this county. And then there was a follow-up a couple months later. The album will be, quote, elegantly bound in genuine Turkish Morocco, printed on the finest paper with gold embossed sides. A corps of biographical writers will soon be in the county gathering up material for this album. Like the atlases, these published works were designed to serve as a, quote, visible reminder that the rude days of the frontier had passed. And so let's think about that for a second, right? The 1887 album reads in part, quote, the Indians in the wilderness have passed away, living now only in history or in the memories of the pioneers who yet remain. In their stead are the well-cultivated farms and fine cities, peopled with intelligent populations and surrounded by arts and refinements of an advanced civilization. Well, I guess that's all well and good, but I do want to point out that the Kickapoo had hardly passed away, and other indigenous peoples of Illinois as well, for they were being subjugated in 1887 by the U.S. government in Brown County, Kansas, and elsewhere. And the remarkable Kickapoo are still here today with us, right? They never disappeared. They're in Kansas, they're in Oklahoma, they're in Texas, and then they're even in Mexico, right? They were not, and they are not disappearing from the scene. I guess what I want to say is they're not here in central Illinois, the Kickapoo that is, because their lands were stolen from them. So my point is not to lecture or to hector, but rather note that the history presented in these atlases and biographical albums are incomplete. So we have to acknowledge that. We can appreciate them, but we have to acknowledge their shortcomings as well. So this is an enlargement of the previous page. I'm taking it from the top illustration of the previous slide. It would have been a point of honor for a farmer to place one of these gilt-lettered tomes on their parlor table to signify their status as a productive and successful citizen of the Republic. 92 illustrations in the 1887 album, almost all of our farmsteads representing 28 of the 30 townships in McLean County. Interestingly, there are no illustrations of farms in Normal Township or West Township, east of Leroy. Yet with the 1874 Atlas, we must keep in mind the farms shown here are not necessarily and always representative of the typical farm of the day. We're seeing the wealthier, the more successful, the more prominent farms. Henry Patton had a nice bank barn, a type of barn once not all that uncommon in this stretch of central Illinois. I talked about the standard square barns, first the English and then the New England barn, but here we have a different type of barn, the bank barn. The selling point of a bank barn, of course, was accessibility from the ground directly to 2 floors of the barn itself. These barns were often built into a hill or a berm to give you that double access or 2-floor access, or a second level could be accessed by a ramp-like structure, either earthen or one made of wood. Also note here the forebay or overbay to provide additional shelter to stock or grain. And we also see on the Henry Patton farm a wonderful view of an iHouse, right? The term iHouse comes from Louisiana State University cultural geographer Fred B. Niffen, who coined the term in 1936. Niffen noticed the prevalence of this house type in rural Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, states beginning with the letter I, hence iHouse, as well as how builders from those areas then carried this layout and design into his home state of Louisiana. Though the I house is a generalized form with a lot of variations, generally speaking, it features gables to the side and an easily recognizable, plain yet in many ways aesthetically satisfying symmetrical layout, measuring at least 2 rooms in length, 1 room deep, and 2 stories high. The standard I house came to have a central doorway and hallway with 3 to 5 windows along the 2nd story and the front. This is the Hubbard House in Hudson. It was on our barn tour when we featured Hudson Township. This I house was built in 2 stages, 15 years apart, by Silas Hubbard, the first physician in the Hudson area. The rear or east wing is actually not an I house proper. That dates to 1857. Silas Hubbard and his wife Juliana made this small cottage their home. Their son Albert Hubbard grew up here. Albert Hubbard later became a celebrated writer and public figure in the turn of the last century. And then in 1872, the Hubbards substantially enlarged their family home with a 2-story I house addition, which fronts Broadway Street. And as you can see here, it's now on the National Register of Historic Places. You do see I houses still occupied, and in this case, unoccupied. Yes, this weathered farmhouse might be old, might be an old and tad forlorn, but it remains a testament, I think, to the craftsmanship and the know-how and the muscle of 19th century Corn Belt. And this is on Illinois Route 164 if you're heading up to Colfax from Cooksville. And there's another view. Let's now look at the J.A. Stevens Place in Mount Hope Township. Many of the 1887 illustrations include a rail line and a chugging locomotive. Do you spot it here? An indication to anyone from the era of the Central Road Railroads played in American agricultural and rural life. So viewers today, we would see this scene as somewhat anachronistic or unusual, right? We've got an idealized farm view, but then yet there's industrialization, there's steam power behind there. Why is that? Well, the farmer here and the illustrator are connecting the farm and its prosperity to the railroad behind. They are one of the same, if you will, right? So by the 1887 album, a lot of these farm illustrations include a locomotive in the distance. This one is accurate because if I look at the 1895 plat book as we are doing here, there we see the 160 acres of the J.E. Stevenson's Place. That little square right there would be the homestead. So the view there then was looking toward the Chicago and Alton rail line right here, right? The main line of the C&A. And again, additional views of domesticity. Perhaps that's the father coming home, greeting a child with some pets. Folks lounging on the front porch, and probably a hired hand handling some of the workhorses there next to the barn. We can't talk about 19th century Corn Belt farming without talking about clay drainage tile, right? What could be more sexy than clay tile? Heifer Tile Company. If you know Bloomington, think of where Lakeside Country Club and Holiday Park and Lake are today. That's where Heifer Tile is located. Manufactured brick, but more importantly, clay drain tile. Among the technological advancements that really reshaped the Corn Belt landscape, clay drain tile stands alongside railroads, grain elevators, steam-powered corn shellers, and other miracles of the age that really changed everything. McLean County farmers, of course, waged a never-ending bitter war against standing water. Think of the slow-to-develop northeastern section of the county, which I had already alluded to with the Bloomer Line. Much of Ford County wasn't settled until very late because of that, right? So you had fired clay pipe, which would then be buried underground, under farm fields to channel surface water to drainage ditches or sloughs or existing waterways, creeks or rivers, right? There is no Midwestern Corn Belt, as I said, without drain tile. So the story is also not only above ground, but the story is also a very important chapter of that story is underground. Heifer's first tile was flat bottom, 2.5 or 3-inch diameter tile, and he switched to completely rounded tile by 1880, and the circumference of his tile increased over time. Here is a view from the 1887 album, not of a farmstead, but of a tile works, right? Pike and Castle. The 1887 McLean County Business Directory lists no less than 15 tile works outside Bloomington Normal, including those in Bellflower, Cropsey, and Ellsworth. Pike and Castle was one of the larger small town or rural tile manufacturers. They were, as we can see here, right along the Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railway, which gave them some advantages, certainly. You even had smaller operations. So this again comes from the 1887 album. This is Joseph Dorland, who had a small tile operation in his Randolph Township farmstead. Many of these operations were in business for only a few years. The market became very saturated very quickly with larger regional and national manufacturings that could boast better access to higher grade clay and enjoyed economies of scales. And soon these kilns would be shut down, never to be fired again. But we do, with the 1887 album, get a wonderful view of the kind of the surprising industrial activity in the Corn Belt in the late 1800s. Again, another representative page. We're going to look at the Gottlieb Arnold farmstead in Towanda Township. We see here all sorts of things, right? An house, a 3-bay barn, and a smaller New England barn. And there is a picture-perfect 3-bay barn. Note the loose hay being moved up to the mow. Once baled hay became the norm in the 20th century, many a farmer had to add supports to the floor joist of their hay mow floor so it wouldn't buckle under the additional weight of baled hay. And we also see in the Gottlieb farm Osage orange hedging. The wood-starved prairie farmer depended to a considerable degree on living fences, certainly before the arrival of railroads that could carry loads of cheap pine board from the North Woods. So prior to the arrival of railroads, certainly, living hedge such as Osage orange, which was originally from the southern Great Plains and then brought up to the Corn Belt, which was then planted in close proximity, one plant at a time, right? Close proximity in a row, carefully trimmed. And once the branches with their 1-inch thorns then could be weaved tightly together, you could create basically an interlocking living fence, which was, quote, horse high, bull strong, and hog tight. There used to be hundreds and hundreds of miles of Osage orange fencing in McLean County alone. Really quite remarkable. Most of that then sadly was yanked out with the industrialization and the mechanization of the Corn Belt that really begins apace after World War II. You still see plenty of Osage orange rows untrimmed, look like lines of trees. There is in the Funk Estate in outside of Shirley, a small a line of trimmed. They still maintain some trimmed Osage orange, which is nice. We see some advertisements. Quote, the Osage orange fence is acknowledged by all who have cultivated the plant to be the cheapest, the best, and the most durable that can be made. And we're going to look here real quickly, another page from the 1887 Portrait and Biographical album. Let's look at that middle image there, just for the fun of it here. Residence of Joseph Denning. So let's hone in on that. Curiously, of the 92 illustrations in the 1887 album, this is the only Bloomington residence. And it's a modest wood frame cottage. And at the time it was owned by a dairyman by the name of Joseph Denning. He probably paid a pretty penny for him to get his house and lot in the 1887 album. And there it is for all posterity. And there's an enlargement of it. But the reason I'm showing this is yes, that house still survives today, right there at 808 East Chestnut Street. And I went out there a few days ago to take a photograph. As we wrap up here, let's look at O.A. Means farmstead in Cheney's Grove Township. The 1874 atlas had 40 plus lithographic illustrations, but only 2 featured windmills. 13 years later, in the 1887 Portrait and Biographical album, windmills are visible in 25 of the 86 or so farm illustrations. So you went from about 4% of the farmstead illustrations having windmills to nearly 30%. So, not to be confused either in appearance or purpose with today's massive wind turbines, these windmills, of course, were designed not to generate electricity, but rather to pump water up from the water table below. And how was that done? Well, you had a gearbox and a crankshaft, which then converted the rotary motion of the fan into reciprocating vertical strokes of a pumping rod, which ran the length of the derrick or tower of the windmill down to the ground level into the groundwater well to pump water. And why did farmers in the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th century need to pump a lot of water, not for human consumption, but for livestock, for cattle and dairy operations? Windmills at this time averaged about 40 feet in height. They were striking at the time because in such a horizontal landscape as the Corn Belt, these are one of the tallest things you would have seen at the time. 40 feet in height, right? Today's wind turbines can be as high as 280 or more feet. Windmills were first constructed of wood. The use of galvanized steel, which came into widespread use in the 1890s, totally revolutionized the industry. Ooh, yes. The death knell for the windmill, though, came in the form of the Rural Electric Act, which in the late 1930s brought electricity to Corn Belt farms. And with electricity came not only electric lights, but what? Electric pumps, which soon supplanted windmills as the power source of choice for farmers needing to pull groundwater up from the surface. And as we wrap it up here, you've been very patient. I appreciate it. Here we see the Italianate brick farmhouse built in 1873 by J.J. Ham, spelled with 1 M or 2, depending on the source you're looking at. McLean County obviously has some spectacular Italianate farmhouses. The most popular would be, or the most widely known would be Duncan Manor or Towanda Meadows, which can be seen from Interstate 55 and the Amtrak. But this is another one. This one is in Hudson Township. And there's another view of it. Here's a contemporary view. James and Ruth Biddingham inherited the home in 1991, moved in after extensive renovations in 1993, and both have since passed away. There's also a bank barn on the Ham place, a New England style bank barn with a rear addition and gable extension. The basement likely served as a manure collection area. The upper ground level was for tie-ups, that is, livestock pens and stalls, and above that, the hay mow and grain storage area. We have the Ruth Biddingham collection at the McLean County Museum of History Archives, and that's where this photograph comes from. Sadly, this bank barn was lost in a fire in 1973. And also in the Biddingham collection, we have this photo of a painting by an unknown artist of this well-known McLean County bank barn. And the McLean County Museum of History library stacks, where I work, is named in memory of Ruth Ham because she was an esteemed genealogist and benefactor to both the McLean County Genealogical Society and the McLean County Museum of History. And I'll end with this image because I think it's just a nice representation of some of the wonderful illustrations we've seen, both from the 1874 Atlas of McLean County and the 1887 portrait and biographical album of McLean County. This is the Smith Soil Farm in Towanda Township. The mechanization of the Corn Belt and all the brute efficiencies it wrought really took off with the gasoline-powered tractors of the 1920s and then the mechanical corn pickers a decade later. The appearance and then rapid dominance of the tractor would bring sweeping changes to the Corn Belt. To cite but one transformation, about 1/4 of all acreage in McLean County had previously been devoted to what? Oats. And why? Oats were needed to feed horses. So prior to the gasoline-powered tractor, 1/4 of all agricultural acreage in McLean County devoted to oats. Once you make the horse obsolete, then you can open up that acreage to what? Ever more intensive row cropping. So let's look at this lovely illustration, and it certainly represents the Corn Belt as it was, not as it is, right? So for all its scientific breakthroughs and successes in feeding the world, the mechanization and the industrialization of the Corn Belt did create certainly a much more homogeneous, much more standardized, and much more less diverse landscape. A much more diverse landscape when it came to the human-made landscape, but also the natural landscape as well. And the wonderful illustrations we've seen today kind of harken back to the period before those dramatic changes really took hold. So we're seeing folks transforming the landscape, but not to the degree that it has been done since, certainly since the post-World War II period. So I probably ran a little late. I apologize. We'll see if we have any questions. So yes, Don, I see your note here. I will share this program with the National Barn Alliance, certainly. Okay. So if anybody else doesn't have any questions, I guess we'll call it a night. I hope everybody enjoys a nice weekend. It's going to get colder than it has been. So buckle up, stay tight, and stay safe. And thank you again for all your time devoting your Thursday evening to Barn Keepers. And we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you again.
Thank you, Bill, for a really great presentation.
Any questions?